It must be true, whatever they say, they said, and I've heard all time is one in the land of the dead. But here and now in the land of the living, 3,000 years ago or thereabouts, there was a king. King David. King David, who was king of Israel. He was inclined to wage war, to fight with his enemies for what he wanted, to turn towards those things that he knew well. And so he was often fighting, often at war, so often that despite gathering all the materials for a great temple, he never actually managed to build it. Now, King David, he fell in love, or at least in lust, with the beautiful Bathsheba, a young woman, and they would spend many a night together. It just so happened that Bathsheba was in fact married. It just so happened that Bathsheba was in fact married to King David's general, Uriah the Hittite. And it just so happened that adultery was much frowned upon. King David and Bathsheba, who perhaps had been sent to seduce him, perhaps it was an innocent love. Either way, they knew that they would not get away with this for long. And King David decided that he wanted what he wanted, and he wanted Bathsheba. And he knew that the way to get what he wanted was, of course, through war. And so he sent his best friend, his general, Uriah, off to war. Not just to any war, but to a war, to a battle that could not be won. A suicide mission. Uriah did not return, and King David married his widow. Bathsheba was pregnant, and King David was delighted. But when the baby was born, it did not live till its naming day, for God had removed his blessing from King David, as this is not the way to go about things. Adultery and betrayal? Oh no, this cannot be. And so King David had to make amends and had to make things right. And he prayed and he went to his advisor, Nathan, and eventually, his peace with God was made again. And Bathsheba grew pregnant once more. When the baby was born, he was named Shlomo, Solomon. A very similar name to peace, for he was symbolizing King David's peace with God. I say symbolizing. He didn't just symbolize it, he embodied it. He not only embodied peace, but he embodied those things that can flourish under peace. Curiosity, knowledge, wisdom. Solomon, even from a very, very small boy, was curious. He would seek out knowledge wherever he could find it. He would seek out wisdom wherever he could find it. He would seek out all that he could find to know about the world. He learned from his father, King David. He learned from his mother, Bathsheba. He learned from his father's spiritual advisor, Nathan, who became his tutor. And even as a small boy, they all recognized in him that he had great capacity for wisdom, that he was somewhat of a genius. Young Solomon did not stop there, however. He learned from every book and scroll he could get his hands on. He learned from every other one of King David's wives. He learned from all of the courtiers in the space. He would sneak into town and learn from the stallholders, learn from the wine sellers, learn from the oyster sellers, learn from the spice merchants and their wives. He would learn from everyone he could find. He studied with the cook and the highest chef in the kitchen. He studied the movements and the stories told by the smallest, weakest servants. He studied everyone and everything and gathered all of that wisdom, that knowledge inside, held in the peace that he was. Now, King David was already old when Solomon was born, and so it did not take long before he was on his deathbed. Bathsheba and Nathan had been advising him, guiding him, helping him, and they were advising and guiding and helping young Solomon too. And young Solomon, well, he was certainly their pick for next king. King David wasn't quite so sure. The military men of the court, not quite so sure. They wanted King David's eldest son, Adoniah, to be the next king, as was traditional, right? The eldest son is the heir, right? Just before he died, Nathan spent some time with King David, and when he emerged, he said, King David, in his infinite wisdom, has decided to bestow the throne and the crown upon his youngest son, Solomon. The military men did not believe him. There was somewhat of a civil war when David died, a scuffle, a skirmish, a bloody and ruthless removal of the old conservative types in the court. Nathan and Bathsheba had been working long and hard to cultivate their strength in the space, and they used it to full effect to ensure that Solomon became King Solomon, young but wise. And as he grew in age, so too did peace in the land grow. Solomon sought out not war, but alliances, trade, partnerships. He would marry the daughters of powerful neighbors and learn from those daughters their ways, their customs, their religions, their paths, their favorite herbs. All that they knew, he would learn and then share that in building these partnerships, these alliances. The trade routes grew strong, and the land and the people of Israel prospered. King Solomon even managed to get his father's temple built. He managed to get it built a lot faster than one would have expected with just human labor. For not only did he build alliances and partnerships with the neighboring human countries, he also built alliances and partnerships with the neighboring worlds of spirits, with the angels and the demons and the jinn, with all the beings of the land that he could form an alliance with, he did. And his strongest alliance among the jinn, King Ashmedai, known today as the king of the demons. Ashmedai, well, he was a powerful ally, and it was his help that got that temple built so fast. King Solomon also had a fantastical throne built with mechanical animals, pairs leading up the stairs, bulls and peacocks and lions and all different kinds. Time passed. Bathsheba and Nathan grew older. Solomon, he went on a little trip, just very briefly, up to a sacred place, and he asked there in the high holy place, he asked God to visit him in a dream. And in his dream, he spoke to God, and God said, Solomon, what would you have? Ask me for anything, and it shall be yours. And Solomon said, I choose wisdom. I long for a heart that listens, that is teachable, that listens to your divine voice of spirit in all things. And God was so impressed by this that not only did they grant Solomon wisdom, but also plentiful gold, jewels, wealth, charisma, love, all of the things that a king might need or wish for. In fact, all of the things that many of us would wish for. King Solomon ruled well, ruled wisely. Not long passed before a bird, a hoopoe bird, had been to visit the Queen of Sheba, to tell her of this fabulous, marvelous, curious genius. Not only a genius, but also a king with power and wealth to match. And the Queen of Sheba, who was herself smart, wise, knowing all of the language, the stories of the stars and the magic therein. Well, being a queen, she was also pretty wealthy. She figured to herself that this would be a man worth meeting. And so she traveled far across the world with great carriages of spice and gold and fabric and gifts for the king. And when she arrived at his court, he welcomed her and her gifts. Now, the Queen of Sheba, her legend preceded her. And King Solomon invited her to dinner. But she was not satisfied with small talk. No. She immediately began testing his wisdom, his knowledge with riddles, questions. And he answered every single one with a riddle of his own. A riddle that answered her riddle and asked anew. This went on back and forth, this meeting of minds. And they knew in each other they had met their match, they had met their peer. They fell in love. And they spent many a night together, sharing their knowledge of magic, teaching each other what they had learned. King Solomon taught her the language of the birds, how to speak to spirits, which perhaps she already knew. And the Queen of Sheba taught him how to read the stars and weave their magic, which perhaps he already knew. But they were sharing. And as they placed these puzzle pieces together, as they heard their wisdom and their knowledge fall from another's lips, it sparked new insight, new curiosities, new questions, new wisdom, the magic that they wove at night. And every night was the magic of love and the magic of knowledge together to bring into the world great things. Unfortunately, the Queen of Sheba was queen of her own land. And while she was there, the people of Israel did well, but the people of Sheba began to suffer for lack of her presence. And so after what seemed like only a momentary visit, she had to return. He could not leave his people to be with her. She could not stay there away from her people. They took their responsibilities and their oaths seriously. And they left, parted ways, with love and inspiration strong between them. In the legends of Ethiopia, it is said that the Queen of Sheba left with more than just a mind full of inspiration and new knowledge, more than just a heart full of love, but that she also had a belly full of newly conceived baby. Be that as it may, her story is a tale for another time, and perhaps one day we shall visit the land of the dead and speak with her and find out her story. But for now, we stay here with King Solomon, inspired, delighted, working his alliances, his partnerships, his trade routes, learning and weaving his magic. Time passed, and as for all people with power, King Solomon began to forget. He began to forget what it was like to not have power, what it was like to not be able to have everything that he desired when he desired it. As a king, he had sworn vows to care for his people, and those vows included to not proliferate weapons, to not hoard wealth while people in his land went hungry, and to not marry excessively for lust. Over the years that follow, King Solomon did all three of these things. He and his court began to keep and hoard weapons and wealth, just in case. For both are forms of power, and when you get to a certain point, you begin to fear that someone else may take it from you. Solomon began to marry for lust, marry every woman that came across his path that he thought might be of some momentary interest. His harem extended and stretched beyond his capacity to learn from them, beyond his capacity to know even all of their names. In breaking his oaths, in becoming careless, in ceasing to listen with his listening heart, King Solomon made himself vulnerable. And his partner, his ally, Ashmedai, king of the Jinn, saw an opening. Ashmedai stole Solomon's magic ring. Ashmedai bound Solomon so he could not use his magic. Ashmedai transformed Solomon's appearance into that of a mere beggar and stripped him of his fine clothes, and instead sat upon Solomon's throne himself, wearing Solomon's face and Solomon's ring and Solomon's cloak and Solomon's crown, as Solomon wandered the desert exiled. Ashmedai did not treat Solomon's people well, but they were no longer really Solomon's people. In the desert, in the wilderness, Solomon began to reflect. He began to listen once more to that still, small voice within. He wrote a book of wisdom, of how to live well. Kohelet. And eventually, his feet carried him to Jordan. His feet carried him into a lowly position in the kitchens, work where he could earn his way. For he had learned from everyone that he could get his hands on, everyone that he could turn his ear to, everyone that he could ask a question, from the lowliest of servants to the richest of merchants, and everyone in between, including the chef in his kitchen, the cooks, the wise women who knew the ways of herbs, and the spice merchants. So Solomon had a really good understanding of what herbs and spices would make really tasty meals. And very quickly he rose up the ranks in the kitchen until he became himself head chef. He would be cooking for the royal family themselves. And it just so happened that the princess, the beautiful young Naamah, fell ill. Solomon cooked her up a special stew using healing herbs chosen for their magic. Now, Solomon himself could not use his own magic, but his wisdom, that could never be taken away. So he made alliances with the plants in the garden. He made alliances with the spirits of the spice. He made alliances with the magic behind the materia. And he stirred all of that healing magic into the stew. When this was delivered to Naamah, and she tasted it and felt that magic, that health flow through her, being a witch herself, she knew that someone in the kitchen had a way about them. Someone in the kitchen knew more than just cooking. Someone in the kitchen knew magic, not just any magic, but powerful magic. She called for the chef to come to see her. Now she engaged him in conversation. He recognized a mind almost as sharp as his own, and she recognized a kindred spirit with great, vast stores of knowledge, of magical knowledge, and the wisdom for how to use it well. From that day forwards, Solomon was Naamah's teacher in the ways of magic. They spent many a long afternoon together, learning, exploring, experimenting, and falling in love. Eventually, Solomon admitted to Naamah what had happened. He told her his tale of woe, and she tried to undo the binding that Ashmedai had placed upon Solomon. But she could not. She was, after all, still young, and Ashmedai was, after all, the king of the jinn. Not to be undone, not to be defeated, still very much in love, the pair decided to elope. They ran away from the court together, in disguise. They found themselves on a beautiful, secluded beach, where they made wedding vows to each other, promises to each other under the full moon. They made love in the moonlight on the soft white sand. And afterwards, Naamah stoked the fire, and Solomon went to catch some dinner in the sea, a fish. But something had changed. Something had shifted. And when Solomon cast his net, he pulled in a golden fish that spoke to him, that told him it was time to return to his kingdom. It was time to return and retake his throne. He had neglected his people for long enough, and now he must face Ashmedai and take care of his responsibilities. Solomon actually was quite enjoying being just a regular guy with a beautiful young wife under the beautiful moonlight, talking of magic and singing to the stars. So he took the fish in, he killed it and carried it up to the fire. They began to slit it open, to gut it, ready for cooking. And there in its belly was Solomon's ring. He placed it on his finger, and the binding was broken. And I'll admit that he did choose to just spend just that last night under the moonlight, under the face of the moon and the stars, by the sea, on the soft white sand with his young wife and a roaring fire, eating baked fish as an ordinary man. As the sun rose, the pair packed up camp and travelled back to Solomon's court, where Solomon faced down Ashmedai, dethroned the king of the jinn, and took his rightful place again, with his new wife by his side, smart enough to remind him when he began to go off track, magical enough that he knew he should listen. And he himself, with that humility, learned from his time in the wilderness, working in the kitchens, and speaking once more to the plants of the earth. King Solomon ruled once more wisely and well. His people prospered. The temple was strong, and peace once more grew in the land. Until he slipped up again. But that is a tale for another time. Whatever they say must be true, they said. And this story is so, I have heard, in the land of the dead. But here and now, from this time and this place, 3,000 years hence, King Solomon sat on his throne,